Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on depression in the heavy vehicle trucking industry. This webinar is part of the National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar series. And just to provide a little bit of background on the program, the NRSPP has been established to provide a collaborative network for Australian businesses and organisations to help them create a positive road safety culture, both internally and externally. It aims to help organisations of all sizes across all sectors to share and build road safety initiatives specific to their own workplace and beyond. It's delivered by ARB and funded primarily by a government coalition and ARB. And if for more information or more tools like this webinar, please refer to the NRSPP website. Now, before we get started, I'll quickly run through some housekeeping items. So you'll see that my name is Neela McCoy and I'll be your moderator today. So please feel free to contact me if you've got any webinar-related inquiries. Our webinar today will run for approximately 50 minutes and we'll be recording this session today, and you'll receive a copy via email along with a presentation at the end. Now, webinars work best when they're interactive, so please feel free to type in any questions that you may have into the questions box throughout. And if you experience any technical glitches, please use the raise your hand function. Now, our lovely presenter today is Taryn Chalmers, and she's a neuroscience researcher from the University of Technology, Sydney. Taryn has spent the last 5 years studying depression in the heavy vehicle trucking industry. She is currently undertaking a PhD, which was endorsed by Sydney Trains, Australia Post and the Australian Trucking Association. Taryn's research passion and presentation at the Australasian Road Safety Conference in 2015 is what led the NRSPP Steering Committee to establishing an award for this year's conference to recognise the best researcher whose research can influence workplace road safety. Now, future conferences will offer this same opportunity to other researchers, thanks to Taryn's inspiration. So let's give Taryn a warm welcome. And Taryn, perhaps before we start, you could tell us a little bit about yourself and the research you're involved in.
Thanks very much for that, Neela. As mentioned, my name is Taryn. I've been researching depression within the heavy vehicle trucking industry for just on 5 years now. Funnily enough, my initial kind of research and neuroscience research goals not so much in the heavy vehicle trucking, but with my father being a truck driver and having driven for 20 plus years, and my brother actually working for the rail industry, this kind of led me towards researching something which I considered to be a really important need in our society. Now, I'm part of the Neuroscience Research Group over at UTS and under the supervision of the wonderful Associate Professor Sarah Lau. And we conduct a wide range of research in our unit, everything from diabetes to police work, and obviously my research with heavy vehicle trucking.
Great.
Now, to get started on today, I'll be discussing the incidence and impacts of depression within the heavy vehicle trucking industry. Now, this is something that's been quite overlooked in previous years. Usually the physiological health of drivers has been really well quantitated and quite well studied, but the psychological health of drivers is really overlooked and has been for many years. Now, as we know, many countries rely on our heavy vehicles for the movement of our goods and services between things like our metropolitan hubs. And in particular in Australia, we have really, really large distances between our metropolitan hubs, and this has facilitated this heavy reliance. Now, the industry itself is a really vital contributor to all aspects of logistics and transportation, and these can really be key determinants in things like a nation's economic development. Now, recently, Boyce suggested that health and well-being of truck drivers really does deserve a lot more attention, and this is for a number of reasons. These include things like ineffective or inefficient supply chains, a shortage of truck drivers due to the perceived negative health effects associated with the industry, as well as things like consistently high rates of illness and injury within the field. We have to remember that the health of the drivers, in particular truck drivers, isn't only important for themselves, but it's also really important for ensuring safe work practices, things like public safety, and even if we can go as far as saying things like efficient operational functioning. Now, as I mentioned, the physiological health of drivers is really, really well quantitated. There's numerous studies that have been conducted over the years. But in Australia, there's only ever been 2 studies conducted assessing the mental health of truck drivers, and even those weren't directly assessing the incidence of depression. They were kind of, offhandedly assessing mental health of these drivers. Now, Australia's heavy vehicle trucking industry, or just its trucking industry in general, presents a really unique workforce profile. This is that the truck drivers in Australia are generally older, or work longer hours per week, and have a greater percentage of full-time work than the average of all other occupations. Now, something to kind of note that's really unique about our heavy vehicle trucking industry is that the industry is 97.5% male. Now, that dominance is one of the highest of any industry in Australia. There's also a number of occupational risk factors for impaired health with regards to our drivers, and some of these are inherent, things that can't necessarily be negated but might be able to be managed. These include things like intermittent rest and work cycles, monotonous driving conditions, the necessity of strict mental alertness, and the obvious workplace isolation. Now, over the years, I've mentioned this previously, there have been a number of studies to assess the health risks for heavy vehicle drivers, things that they may be an increased incidence of developing. These include things like pain, cancer, sleep apnea, diabetes, and the one that's somewhat understudied that I'll be talking about today is the risk of things like affective disorders, in particular depression. Now, depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide when measured by years lived with disability. In the year 2000, it was the fourth greatest contributor to the global burden of disease. And it's been suggested that by the year 2020, which when we think about it is only in 4 years, it will be the second greatest contributor to this burden. Now, depression affects approximately 350 million individuals worldwide, and 11.6% of the Australian population. Although it should be noted, the 11.6% incidence rate that we have may be significantly underrepresenting levels of depression, because generally individuals will, in particular males, will refrain from disclosing information that may infer vulnerability. So it's less likely that males will generally go and see a GP and report things like mental illness. So the incidence rates that we have may actually be a lot higher. It's also been found that without effective treatment, depression will generally reoccur in about 50% of individuals. Now, because of all of these factors together, it's really important that we raise awareness of depression, especially in industries that are really male-dominated, like the heavy vehicle trucking industry. Now, across the very few studies that have been conducted, depression has been found to be higher than average in the Australian heavy vehicle truck drivers. Now, this isn't just endemic to Australia. Overseas studies have found very similar results. Now, the studies that have been conducted have an estimates that range from 13 to 21% of Australian truck drivers having them suffer from depression. Now, as I mentioned, only 2 studies have been conducted to assess the levels of depression in trucking in Australia. But overseas estimates have found the rate of depression in the industry to be as high as 70%. Now, that's huge. That's a really, really high rate of depression. There was also a study that was done in 2007 that found that 14.5% of truck drivers felt more depressed since starting work within the industry. Now, my PhD, which will be concluded very shortly, found that the truck drivers that I assessed showed significantly higher levels of depression than both my trained drivers that I assessed and a normal sample. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Australian trucking industry is really male-dominated, 97.5% male-dominated. Now, this is an issue when we consider things like males are less likely to reveal information that may infer vulnerability, and as such, the rates of depression within this industry may actually be a lot higher than what we're finding. Now, it's been quite well researched, and it is quite well known that depression does impair driving ability. Across the board, generally it's found that depression causes or increases the risk of an accident while driving. Now, when we consider the studies that have been done in recent years, there was a study done by Hilton in 2009 that assessed the link between the severity of depression and an impact on driver performance in truck drivers. Now, this study in particular found that severe and extremely severe depression was associated with a 4 times greater risk of being involved in an accident. And even more recently, there was a study conducted which assessed 100 truck drivers, Australian truck drivers, who were involved in an accident in the previous year versus 100 truck drivers who were not involved in an accident in the previous year. This was done in Western Australia, and this study found that those who'd reported being diagnosed with depression were almost 7 times as likely to be involved in a crash in the previous year. Now, overall, there is a really strong link between depression and impaired driver performance and crash risks. Now, we have an industry based on an individual's ability to operate a large vehicle, and we also have an industry that potentially has very high levels of depression. Now, when you put these two together, it paints a pretty worrying picture about the impact of depression on our heavy vehicle truckers. Now, there are a number of workplace risk factors for depression, some of which are inherent to truck driving, which is the way it is. So these unique workplace conditions are things that I've mentioned before, things like long working hours, our intermittent rest and work cycles, workplace solitude, shift work, fatigue, and things like extreme occupational pressure. Now, these really common workplace factors for the heavy vehicle trucking industry can result in these individuals being viewed as what we call a depression vulnerable population, meaning that they are very vulnerable to the development of depression. Now, there was a recent study conducted that assessed the impact of long working hours on the risk for depression, and this study by Vertman found that working 11 or more hours a day increased the risk of depression by 2.5 times. Another study also found that about 26% of rotating shift workers, which most truck drivers are, will develop a thing called shift work disorder, and that in turn has been shown to increase our risk of depression quite significantly. Now, the risks or the impacts of depression aren't just physiological, and they're not just to the employee, they're also to the employer. So, as we know, the economical impacts of depression are quite varied and quite vast. We have situations in Australia where there's a lot of things like absenteeism, workers' compensation claims. All of these things contribute to the economical impacts of depression. Now, there was a recent PricewaterhouseCoopers report that estimated Australian business would lose $10.9 billion each year for failing to appropriately manage mental health in the workplace. But that same report actually found that businesses that do take steps to manage mental health will on average see a return of $2.30 for every $1 invested in mental health schemes. Now, the transport industry came out quite on top. This report found that within the transport industry alone, for every $1 invested in mental health schemes within the workplace, these businesses saw a return of $2.80. Now, I kind of touched on this before. Mental health in the workplace isn't just endemic to Australia. There's 350 million, approximately, individuals worldwide that are suffering from this disorder. In the US alone, a bit of research, and I found that the lost productivity due directly to depression was between $31 and $52 billion annually. Now, these are huge figures, and figures that hopefully with a bit of awareness and some slight changes within the workplace we might be able to reduce. Okay, before we get going on some solutions, is there any questions?
Yeah, I've had a couple of questions that have come in.
Right.
Feel free to send some more through, anyone, if you'd like to ask anything. The first one is, sometimes people medicate with drugs and alcohol and may not be diagnosed as depressed, and how are these people calculated in the studies?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I mean, this is something that we quite often deal with even in basic scientific research. Unfortunately, with the way that depression manifests and the social perception around depression, it's quite difficult for individuals in Australia and other countries to admit things like depression, to seek appropriate help. So individuals who are self-medicating and aren't receiving appropriate medical assistance, they simply cannot be included. That's the reason why we say our figure of 11.6% is quite conservative, because acquiring a true incidence of something like depression can really be difficult.
Okay, great. Another question, has there been any studies filtering the difference between impacts on long-haul drivers and those who are more metro-based?
Yeah, it's actually another really great question. My particular study only looked at short-term kind of drivers who are relatively metropolitan-based. However, there have been a number of studies that have assessed, in particular there was one in Norway from memory. I think it was a 4,478 person sample size, so it was a really big study. And there's been a range of studies that have assessed the impact of long-haul versus kind of metropolitan drivers, and quite across the board it's been found that long-haul drivers are at a greater risk of developing depression, purely because there's a number of workplace factors which are somewhat reduced in metropolitan drivers, things like the intermittent rest and work cycles, the monotonous driving conditions, and these are factors that all contribute to the development of depression within this population.
Great. We've got another one that's come in. Are there any questions or assessments for mental illness during a heavy vehicle drivers assessing fitness for commercial vehicle drivers?
Look, there is a small section on mental health, but as I mentioned, I mean, most of these drivers are males. It is very difficult for a male, and this isn't an opinion, this is well studied and well researched, it is quite difficult for a male generally to admit anything that might seem or make him seem vulnerable. So males will generally, underreport things like mental illnesses, and that's the reason why even basic assessment or fitness to drive, applications are really only very cursory. It's a very limited amount of assessment, and when you're asking a male to self-report his, mental illness issues, it's very unlikely that there will be kind of accurate reporting of these disorders.
Okay. Another one, what would be the average length of time a driver would meet the diagnostic criteria for depression?
Just to clarify, do you mean the average time that a person would be suffering from depression, or the average time before they would be diagnosed?
All right, Shane, if you wouldn't mind just clarifying that, and we could get back to that question. Another one that's come in, this is quite long, so just bear with me. I can't quite get my head around the stats showing that those who are diagnosed have a much greater crash risk when we know that there is likely a high level of undiagnosed. Wouldn't those undiagnosed be at a greater risk also, and therefore affect the general rates? So can you comment on diagnosis?
No, that's a really astutely picked up question. Really great question. This is something I actually analysed a little bit within my own study. I did a literature review not that long ago, kind of assessing globally the incidence rates of depression. Now, most of the studies that have been conducted do screen the individuals who have not been diagnosed for depression. And if they show depression or depressive symptomology, they were then excluded from that, non-depressed cohort or the non-crash cohort. So that was a small way of being able to stratify and saying those that did not have an accident were also not suffering from depression, although there is a limitation in that because reflective reporting, as we call it, which is asking someone to reflectively state if they were suffering from a mental illness that might have been 6 months ago or 8 months ago, can sometimes be a little bit difficult. But by ensuring that both cohorts are assessed for depression, and then any individuals who, say for instance on a thing called the Beck's Depression Inventory, which is quite often used, are suffering from high levels of depression or depressive symptomology, they're then generally excluded from that cohort. So it kind of gives the most accurate representation that's possible.
Okay, great. And just back to Shane's question, he's clarified.
Yeah.
So the original question was, what would be the average length of a time a driver would meet the diagnostic criteria for depression, and that's the average time they would be depressed.
Oh, great. Yeah, sorry. So generally we say it's between 3 to 6 months of consistent depressive symptomology. However, that varies. I mean, individuals may suffer from intermittent depression, which is, bouts of depression followed by bouts of mania. It's really something for a GP and for a psychologist to assess. However, if it's impacting daily life and impacting an individual's ability to operate, then we consider it to be a problem.
Okay, fantastic. That were great questions, everyone. That's all we've got for the moment, Taryn, so back over to you.
Okay, wonderful. And yeah, they were wonderful. Thank you very much for the questions. Okay, now we move on to some strategies, things that can be done in the workplace. Now, all of these come from the Australian Human Rights Commission. These are suggestions of ways to improve and create a healthy workplace within an industry. So the first is the most, basic, I suppose you could say, to create a safe and healthy workplace. So these are things like identifying possible workplace practices, actions, or incidents that may cause or contribute to the mental health of workers. So this is where management comes in, being able to identify things that may potentially increase risks of depression, and also taking actions to eliminate or minimise these risks. The second is effective communication strategies. Now, we know that treating things like depressions or even managing it is really, really benefited from services such as cognitive behavioural therapy, which is really talking with implemented strategies. Now, communication strategies have been shown unequivocally to improve mental health within an industry. It allows individuals to talk and have open dialogue about what might be happening. So talking with your workers about any mental health issues and negotiating what we call reasonable adjustments in the workplace. This might be things like shortening shift lengths, even changing locations of shifts in order to ensure that individuals are not suffering or that these are minimising potential risks. Also obtaining advice and assistance from external support services. Now, this is without disclosing personal information, as that would breach a number of laws, but there are a number of external support services, some of which I'm going to take you through in a little bit, that are really great as far as providing information to both employees and employers about managing mental health within the workplace. Also, allied health professionals. Now, GPs and other treating practitioners are well trained in dealing with mental health. This isn't just as an individual basis, but also dealing with mental health, for your employees. Now, I did mention responsible adjustment and a few examples. These could be things like job rotation, varied start and finish times, and also potentially changing some aspects of the job. Now, I do understand and absolutely acknowledge that sometimes there are things that are just inherent to the job that cannot be changed. But this is about making responsible and reasonable adjustments where applicable. The next is the commitment to a strategy for creating a healthy work environment. Now, this is a really important one. Allowing your employees to see that you, as a managerial staff or as a company, are committed to improving mental health in a workplace is beneficial to everyone. So these commitment from senior managers and other senior staff to developing a healthy workplace through mission statements and policies is really important. Also, managers demonstrating their commitment by implementing the strategies. It's great to make them, wonderful to make them, but unfortunately, if they're not implemented, it's really difficult to see any benefit. Also, making all staff aware of managerial commitments to having a healthy and safe working environment. If all staff are aware that the managers themselves are committed to improving mental health within the workplace, it'll ensure that this filters down throughout the entire industry. Also, proactive measures to achieve a healthy and safe workplace. So this is harping on a little bit from the previous one, but ensuring that we have effective policies and procedures and offering things like flexible working arrangements. Also, another really important process, or a really helpful process in managing mental health within the workplace, is things like mentoring and peer support systems. Now, peer support systems have been shown to be really effective, in particular in male-dominated industries, when individuals feel like they can have a chat to their mates and their colleagues about things that might be happening. It removes a lot of that stigma that does surround mental illness. Also providing counselling services or things like special support groups. Now, this is something an industry can do, or a workplace, an employer can provide. And counselling services have been shown to improve mental health quite significantly, in particular things like cognitive behavioural therapy. And individual education and training. Now, this isn't just for managerial staff, this may also be for employees. And I'm going to discuss a few options as far as education and training in future slides. And overall, just ensuring safe and healthy work conditions within the workplace. Now, what else can be done? These are some of the courses and screening programs. The first is mental health first aid. So Mental Health First Aid is a really great website and training program that allows or provides mental health training. So allows individuals or trains individuals to administer mental health first aid. So the course content is derived from a number of consensus studies incorporating the expertise of hundreds of researchers, clinicians and mental health consumer advocates. I've popped the website up there, feel free to have a look. This is a great, really, really great service that is offered. The next is health screening. I had the absolute pleasure of meeting with David Stanley, who is the creator of Prevention Express. And Prevention Express is a wonderful program that offers rapid, convenient and confidential preventative health screening processes in a range of different workplace settings. So the things that it tests for, things like cardiovascular disease, tobacco-related harm, alcohol-related harm, diabetes, mental health, a huge range of possible health factors. The way that it works is that first there's a mental health professional who comes in and records really key measurements, things like height and weight, blood pressure, and also does a finger prick test for diabetes. And then the second thing is a screen-based questionnaire, and this is screening for things like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mental health, etc. And then what will happen is the participant will receive a hard copy and a copy on their mobile phones, and it's a report that's colour-coded. So the green signal indicates a clean bill of health, which is then backed up by some of these targeted health prevention information schemes. The amber signal or the orange signal generally suggests that the person may need to see a doctor or consult a health professional. And a red signal indicates to the person that they need to take action and contact an appropriate medical provider as soon as possible. The Prevention Express also provides to the employer a detailed report which analyses the de-identified data, so it's all private, from their workplace, and it allows individuals to provide or create targeted health schemes, so targeted schemes for their industry. The final is Heads Up. Now, Heads Up is a wonderful resource for both the individuals and businesses themselves, and it provides a range of free tools and resources to take action to improve mental health. Now, the website has a number of really great free resources. These include things like leadership kits and also fact sheets, and these assist with the management of mental health in the workplace. So all of these are just a few of many, many possible management tools, but all are really wonderful. And I've spent a lot of time looking over, all three of these potential management systems. Now, what's the overall message? I'm probably going to, segue a little bit off this slide and just talk to you guys for a couple of minutes. I think the first big thing to note is that depression, one of the key indicators or the ways that depression can manifest is a reduction in a neurotransmitter called serotonin. Now, serotonin, chemically speaking, is very similar to another neurotransmitter, which is called dopamine. Now, when you have too low levels of dopamine, you end up with Parkinson's disease. And too low levels of serotonin, you end up with depression. Now, thinking about your general life, would you ever say to someone with Parkinson's disease, toughen up, you'll be right, it'll be all right? I'm really hoping the answer to that is no. Depression is a neurochemical imbalance in the brain. It is something that is just as real as Parkinson's disease or cardiovascular disease or diabetes. It's something that needs to be managed. Now, we know that depression in this industry is a lot higher, significantly higher than the general population, and our rates that we have are probably lower than the true incidence. We also know that depression reduces things like driving performance, and this is a big issue when we have an industry based on an individual's ability to operate a heavy vehicle. Now, it's also costing Australian businesses $10.9 billion annually, which is a huge economic impact. I suppose the overall take-home message is managing depression appropriately in a workplace doesn't only improve the workers' and employees' health, but also things like workplace proactivity and reducing the cost for a company. Truck drivers are really important. I know, my father's one. I know how important they are to Australia. We need to look after them, and this all starts in the workplace. Thank you very much, guys. Any questions?
Great, thanks so much, Sharon. Yep, I've got a couple of questions here. that I'll share. So the first one has two parts to it. So work health and safety laws include requirements in managing workplace conflict and work-related stress through the better design and management of work. What practical things can organisations do to manage conflict and time pressures at delivery points?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. It's something that, I'm not in HR, I'm in research, but my advice is it just comes from years and years of, interviewing both employers and employees. And it's all about an individual approach. I mean, every person can't be micromanaged, unfortunately, especially with large industries. But if there is an issue and something arises, it's about managerial staff being committed to ensuring that the mental health is a priority, that improving mental health is a priority. Now, as far as practicality goes, things like shortening shift length, I mean, as I mentioned, working 11 hours or more a day has been shown to increase depression rates by 2.5 times. That's a huge increase. Also, things like ensuring that individuals or employees know that mental health is a priority within the workplace. It opens up dialogue. It allows individuals, even if it's not so much talking to their managerial staff, but talking to one another about mental health, removes that social stigma. And that social stigma is associated with a lot of individuals, continued suffering with depression, this, fear of seeking help. An individual, is as human beings, we want to survive, we want to improve our health conditions. Now, if we can remove that social stigma in a workplace, individuals will be much more likely to ensure they do seek appropriate medical help for things like mental illness.
Okay, great. And the second part to that question was, how can we support drivers from exposure to road trauma?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Something else I've written a review on. As far as road trauma goes, this is something that is an inherent part of the job. It's something that we can't eliminate because it's unpredictable, and it's, being on the road for that many hours means that individuals will almost certainly at some point be exposed to some road trauma. Now, this is where things like external counselling services can be really good, ensuring that your employees know that counselling services are available through the company or through the industry, and ensuring that they have appropriate access to these services. It's no good having one letter once suggesting that they could possibly see a counsellor. It's something that needs to be included in everyday discussions and ensure that all individuals and all employees know that there are services that can be accessed.
Okay, great. Another question. I attended a mental illness seminar earlier in the week facilitated by the NRL State of Mind program. They identified that suicide is the largest killer of individuals aged between 15 to 44. Any idea how many of your target group fall into this group as well? For example, even higher potential risk?
Yeah, that's a great question. I also wanted to attend that seminar but couldn't, unfortunately, with work commitments. My study particularly just looks at depression. Now, suicide is a absolutely devastating consequence of often mental illness. Now, a lot of the drivers that I did assess, the mean age for my drivers was 36.4 years of age, which means the large majority of the individuals that I studied fell within that bracket of an increase in suicide risk. Now, as far as the male dominance goes, it's well known and well quantitated that males are more likely to succeed in suicide than females, which means that the industry is not only suffering under the burden of depression, but also a potential increased risk of successful suicides. And this is something that needs to be accounted for, even with basic stratification of my data. I have a few questions, especially part of the Beck's Depression Inventory, which is one of our psychological questionnaires that we use that does assess suicide risk and rates or suicidal ideations. And this is something that needs to be accounted for, and also needs to be considered within an industry that is 97.5% male.
Okay, great. Got a few more questions. So another one is, are there any strategies that you have seen work well to help reduce the isolation risk that these drivers experience?
Yeah, look, this is something that I've been, discussing and talking about for years. It's something that is very difficult to overcome. I'm actually in the process of attempting beginning work on potentially creating a radio station that may be accessed by long-haul or all truck drivers that just includes information about, basic health, but also, things that keep individuals interested, so sports news, music, all that kind of stuff. The thing as far as, immediate reduction in depression incidents for the long haul, or at least reducing the impacts of long-haul driving and that isolation on the risk of depression, it's a very, very, uphill battle. It's something that needs to be done. It's an inherent part of the job, but it's also something that's really impacting our drivers. This is something that my father was a long-haul driver for many years. It's something that is really, really close to my heart, and I've been working non-stop for about 2.5 years trying to come up with something that might improve their outcome, or at the very least reduce the burden of that long-haul driving. All I can say is, I will do my best, and I will keep analysing other studies and other countries until we find a solution.
All right, another one. Are there any studies that differentiate between the safety and risks of those who are diagnosed and receiving or participating in treatment, and those who are diagnosed but not managing their depression? Otherwise, the impression is that being diagnosed increases your risks rather than the depression itself.
Yeah, I understand the thought process there. Look, there have been quite a few studies that look at driver performance before and after treatment. Not necessarily in heavy vehicle drivers. I know there's been a number of inpatient versus norm post-diagnosis, no treatment studies. Now, post-treatment, it's unequivocal. It's, completely the reduction or improvement, in driver performance is really well quantitated. So we know that improving depressive symptomology, in particular short-term, improves things like steering reaction time. It improves things like visual acuity on the road, even ability to maintain strict mental alertness. All of these things are improved with adequate treatment. Now, the big study that was done of the 100 drivers in Western Australia versus the 100 drivers in Western Australia who had been diagnosed with depression, that study, not all of the drivers were adequate or were managing their depression. I can't tell you the exact proportion. The study hasn't actually been released yet. It was done by a PhD student and it's waiting for completion. So I only got a very brief overview of the study. But most studies, or all studies that I've read that look at the impact of things like antidepressant and cognitive behavioural therapy on driving performance, have found a significant increase or improvement of driver performance when depression is being appropriately managed.
Okay, great. I've got one more question here. We've got a few minutes left, so if you've got anything else that you'd like to send Taryn's way, please feel free to send them through. Absolutely. So within an industry that has a standard hours regime of 12 hours, should the regulator change that direction?
Once again, I'm speaking from a science background and the science point of view, and my overarching and resounding opinion would be yes. I mean, this increase in depression rates for individuals working for greater than 11 hours is across the board. It's not just in truck drivers, it's in every industry. Now, the logistics of actually doing that may be difficult, and I acknowledge that. But my resounding opinion would be yes. There needs to be some alteration to the standard working hours and the 12-hour shift.
Okay. Are you aware of any industry-specific programs to support workers in this industry who have mental illness?
Not so much industry-specific, but there are a number of different screening processes available that can be applied to any industry. So as I mentioned, Prevention Express is just I was just unbelievably astounded at how amazing it is as far as health screening for individuals. Now, the transport industry finds itself in a very unique position. And that position being that A, it's really male-dominated, B, there's a number of very unique workplace conditions that do predispose individuals to depression, and yet, there needs to be some management of mental illness within this industry. Now, as far as I know, there are ones that can be applied to the transport industry, but none at the minute that are transport industry specific.
Okay, great. They're all the questions that have come in so far. So thank you, everyone, for that. And thank you, Taryn. It's so great to have a presenter on board who's so passionate about such an important topic. So thank you for all your time and effort into today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Neela.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. Now, just as we wrap up, we'd love to hear any feedback that anyone has, and there's going to be a survey that's going to launch shortly. And we hope that everyone will join us again for future webinars. So take care. Thanks very much.